From romance to science fiction now, the one genre you probably weren't expecting to see on this list, and for good reason. Most sci-fi films don't tend to rip off Indiana Jones, they're too busy ripping off Star Wars instead. Occasionally though, you get a movie that tries to be a little bit of both with a wink and a smile. And that's where The Ice Pirates comes in. In a kinda silly future where all remaining water is under the control of the totalitarian Templars, which is a fun phrase to say, the titular ice pirates attempt to steal just that, only to end up being captured. Fortunately, they're rescued from being castrated, no, really, by a princess who wants them to help her find her father, who went missing while looking for the legendary 7th planet. If that all sounds a little bonkers, then congratulations, you found this film's biggest selling point. It's completely bananas. I don't say that lightly either. This is the kind of film where they don't really explain the world that the film takes place in, preferring instead to just throw you in at the deep end and see whether you sink or swim. Hopefully you can breaststroke, because if so, you'll encounter people wearing the most ridiculous outfits imaginable, imaginative sets that the film only lingers on for a minute before moving on to the next, alien creatures that are amazing in how goofy they are, robots all over the place, random roles for Angelica Houston and Ron Perlman, and an absurd climax that ultimately ends by just, you know, I'm not even going to spoil what happens at the end. I think you should watch it and find out. Though I will say that if you're prone to seizures due to flashing lights, there is a scene on the bridge towards the end that you'll want to avoid watching. When you see a reflection in a helmet, you'll want to look away for a minute until you hear the word charge. Aside from that, this is a very special kind of movie, one that clearly had a ton of effort poured into it, a cast that is going all in with it despite how ridiculous everything is, and a tone that is occasionally serious but usually pretty wacky. And frankly, if you're willing to go with your average indie ripoff and the nonsense that's in those, chances are you'll click with this one as well. I'm not going to say this is a good film, it's clear they had half the budget they really needed. Seriously, MGM slashed the initial $20 million budget down to 8, and it constantly shows. The effects in space are somewhat dated, and some of the comedy is a little too on the broad side, but none of those really hold the film back that much. And given that we have, and will, encounter films that are better made but less entertaining, I'll take poorly made and fun any day of the week, because as this list proves, a film that's just plain fun is worth more than all the ice on Mithra. Heading back down to Earth now, you know you're probably in for a goofy time when the very first shot of a movie is a parody of the James Bond gun barrel sequence, which promptly zooms in onto a woman's cleavage. Hell, Windows decided to make that image the thumbnail for the video file, so at least I went into this one in the right mindset. That opening shot, along with the rest of the scene, establishes what kind of film this is going to be, when a shopkeeper is killed by 3 black-clad ninjas? I'm not quite sure what they are, but they deflect bullets with their spinning shurikens and are thwarted in their attempts to steal the eye from a statue by the cops, one of whom, after being stabbed, pulls out the knife and stabs a ninja in the neck with it. In short, this opening establishes that, much like The Ice Pirates, the film ahead is going to be ridiculous. Unlike The Ice Pirates though, I don't think it's ridiculously awesome. Brought to us in his directorial debut by Jim Wynorski, a master of gloriously low-budget 80s nonsense, The Lost Empire follows up from that opening massacre with a hard-as-nail chick who seeks to fulfill the dying wish of the cop who did the neck stabbing, who it turns out was her brother. After being told his death was probably in relation to the 2 eyes of Avatar, one of which, the one the ninjas were after, decides randomly to start living in her bag, she determines she needs to head to the island of Dr. Sin Do, who has the other eye. But she can only get there as part of a trio, so recruits an old friend who's supposed to be a Native American, yeah right, and a convict with attitude and an endless supply of gum to travel to the island and get to the bottom of the whole thing. As you might have gathered, the whole point of the film is largely an excuse to have a bunch of pretty ladies wear skimpy outfits and do a bunch of athletic stuff, and on that front it takes a while to get going, but once it's there, it's exactly what you'd expect. There's women in skimpy outfits in a prison fight, women in skimpy outfits doing training, women in skimpy outfits battling to the death. This film knows what you're here for, and it's got plenty of it. Unfortunately, as attractive as these women are, some of them anyway, none of them are particularly great acting-wise, being more along the level you'd expect from, well, you know what. You could make the argument that they don't exactly need to be great actresses for this sort of thing, and there is random nudity to help distract from this particular shortcoming, but their not so great performances are the biggest weakness in a film that kind of feels like a softcore porno without the porn. The plot's bare bones, the sets are cheap, the acting's fairly weak, and the action, such as it is, isn't all that either. There are some fun moments sprinkled throughout, and I won't say this is unwatchable or anything, but it's hardly the greatest film Wynorski made. And while he would go on to make some truly great B-movies, this is not one of them. Sticking with topless women, Gwendolyn, or to give it its full name, The Perils of Gwendolyn in the Land of the Yik Yak, yes, really, is loosely based on a bondage-themed comic by John Wiley. And the film adaptation is brought to us by the director of Emmanuel and the Story of O. If those names mean anything to you, then be warned, it's not exactly what you're imagining, though given I started talking about this film with the phrase topless women, you wouldn't exactly be a million miles away either. Story-wise, the titular Gwendolyn has escaped from a convent, driven by a vision she had in her dreams to try and find her father, who's gone missing in Hong Kong while looking for a rare butterfly. Unfortunately, having spent her entire life at a boarding school, she's pretty naive, so has to rely on others, namely a deeply unpleasant mercenary, to help her in her goal, and even then she ends up getting kidnapped and imperiled a fair bit, which doesn't make for the most engaging protagonist, so it's a good thing she becomes more proactive once she learns her father was killed and she decides to finish his hunt for the butterfly. When I mentioned topless women earlier, I may have kind of oversold this, because it's actually nowhere near as erotic a film as you might be imagining. There's a few boobs here and there, sure, especially once they get to the titular land of the Yik Yak, since it's inhabited by nothing but topless women, to the point you stop noticing after a while. Unlike The Lost Empire though, it wasn't the only reason the film was made. There's something resembling a story being told here, and as bonkers and seemingly made up as they went along as it is, it's a ton of fun to watch. It's a shame then that I have to call out the main characters, who are either new for the film or might as well be, since they're so different from their comic counterparts. The not in the comic mercenary is pretty awful for the first half of the film, treating everyone like crap and only doing things for himself. It's a pretty standard character for this type of film, but the script here massively overplays the negative aspects while giving him very few positive ones to balance him out. And the actors are no Harrison Ford or Brendan Fraser, so while he's handsome enough, the fact he acts so unpleasantly while displaying no real redeeming qualities makes him more than a little off-putting. Meanwhile, the actress playing Gwendolyn has to struggle playing someone that is essentially the comic character spliced with an entirely different one. In the comic, she's overly naive, leading to numerous situations where she's kidnapped and tied up, which is what you'd expect for a bondage-based series. The film, meanwhile, also tries to make her a more independent, go-getting, spur-of-the-moment sort of person. But in execution, it means that she can often bounce between these two personalities depending on what the scene requires, which means there's no real consistency to the character, so it's hard to get a handle on her. And as for the inevitable romance between the two leads, even if it was a nice change for them to declare their entirely unearned love for each other halfway through the film, rather than waiting until the end, one's an arsehole and the other's got a split personality. Somehow I don't see it working out. Really, I think that's the biggest flaw of the film. The actors are all doing their best, but the script doesn't give the characters they're playing the depth they desperately needed. There's really only so much an actor can do with bad material. It's a real shame because there is a fair bit to enjoy about this film, and it's definitely nice to have a movie where a woman is kind of the lead. The ultimate irony is, I think this would have worked better if they'd not had Gwendolyn be based on the comic character, because then they could have had her be more well defined, rather than the half and half they ended up with. Staying with beautiful women, but on a slightly less frustrating note, Wet Gold is a TV movie remake of the 1948 film The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. It stars Brooke Shields as a down-on-luck waitress turned amateur gold hunter, who, believing the stories of an old drunk Burgess Meredith, goes diving for the boat he was the sole survivor of, and the treasure that sunk with it, hence the name of both films. Shields was a 19-year-old model-turned-actress whose big break had come earlier that same year in Sahara, not to be confused with the Matthew McConaughey film from the 2000s. I considered covering Sahara for this list, but ultimately chose not to because that film isn't really an indie line. It's basically about winning a race, with some rather questionable ethnic stereotyping along the way. That's not to say Sahara is bad, it's still a fine little film in its own right, even if Shields did win a Razzie for it, but Wet Gold is a little more along the lines of what we're here for, since it's specifically about the search for a lost treasure and the effect it has on the group who go after it. Plus, it's on YouTube, so it's a tad more accessible. Sadly, Shields is still fairly new at this whole acting thing, and her performance is fairly amateurish as a result, something the rest of the cast seem to be using as an excuse to not exactly bring their A-games. The fact it's an 80s TV movie gives them a bit of leeway, but not that much. It's hard to convince your audience to care about the characters if the actors can't really be bothered to. One thing I do appreciate is that the film's setup is taken care of and the voyage is underway within around 15 minutes, so we're not really wasting much time up front. Unfortunately, that means we have to waste it later on, and that, above all else, is what really sinks this film, if you'll pardon the pun. There's lots of long, drawn-out dialogue scenes with an amateur actress, the only woman in the film by the by, a drunk old man, and two completely interchangeable 20-something guys who lose their tempers with alarming regularity. And since they're basically trapped together on a boat, that means there's no escape from them. Repetition sets in very quickly as a result, and even the sight of Shields in a surprisingly sizable selection of skimpy swimwear doesn't save the situation. Is this a terrible film? No, not really. It's competently shot, there's a variety of events to keep things fresh, even if they are exactly what you'd expect, like someone falling overboard or the drunk guy screwing up a simple task, and the latter half of the film, where they've found the gold and one of the group goes completely nuts for it, does pick up a little. But it's really nothing special, and if you guess that most of the gang dies because greed gets the better of them and the survivors end up with basically nothing, congratulations, you've seen a movie before. I think the best way to describe this is that it's a Sunday afternoon sort of film. The sort of thing you put on in the background when you're doing doing other stuff, and occasionally glance up when the rather irritating and repetitive soundtrack kicks in to let you know something interesting is happening. So it's similar to modern television on that front, if nothing else. Otherwise, there's not really a whole lot here to keep you interested, and if all you're here for is a 19-year-old girl in a variety of bikinis, you do know the internet exists, right? There's better quality stuff out there. And I mean that in every sense of the word, since the DVD I got looks like a VHS transfer, so good luck even seeing the hot chick. Time for our last entry from 1984, and while it's not as gloriously named as Land of the Yik Yak, Yellow Hair and the Pecos Kid, also known as Yellow Hair and the Fortress of Gold, at least tries to rival that film in terms of having a silly name, or two. Neither quite matches Yik Yak, but then again, it's a better film overall, so I consider that a worthy compromise. You wouldn't know that from the opening few minutes though, since the film's trying to be a deliberate throwback to the days of 1940s TV shows, and as such opens with a bunch of kids sitting down to watch a cinema screen, which leads into a rundown of all the characters with their core defining traits, and is followed by a literal in the last episode block of text. It's charming in a quaint sort of way, but there is a reason we don't do this anymore. Nowadays we tend to introduce characters in a more organic manner, rather than forcing audiences to sit and read character briefs. You know, unless you're an awful Hollywood blockbuster anyway. Once you're past that, it isn't long before the movie opens proper, and within a minute, a man falls over the edge of a cliff, turning into a blatantly obvious dummy in the process. Your reaction to this will likely determine your views on the film as a whole. If you think it's cheap and awful, you will not like this movie. If you think it's hilarious, you'll probably be able to overlook the weird tonal shifts and just enjoy the gloriously absurd nonsense that lies ahead. For the most part, the film is relatively straightforward. Old Western and French legionary style bad guys are after the titular Fortress of Gold, and Yellow Hair, yes, that's what she's called, aided by the Pecos Kid, yes, that's what he's called, have to stop them, while also finding out the truth of her origins. And on the whole, it's a fairly light, breezy sort of affair, except for brief moments that are surprisingly not child-friendly, which contrasts greatly with the more fun action the majority of the film contains. So every so often you'll get things like headless corpses being tied to horses that are forced to ride into town, or a man being uncomfortably trampled by several horses during a chase. These moments really feel out of sorts with the rest of the film, which is otherwise a little rough around the edges, especially with the scene transitions, but is charming enough in its own way. The action in particular is quite fun, with things like your typical wagon chase, and more amusing scenes like the bad guys hiding snakes and tumbleweeds, which, like that opening dummy fall, is so ridiculous it's awesome. There may only be so much you can do with westerns, but this film does its best. At the end of the day, this is a mostly entertaining, occasionally upsetting little romp that doesn't punch too far above its weight and works pretty well as a result. It's not going to set the world on fire, but it's fun enough, and it's neat to see a more western-inspired indie adventure. One fun fact about the film, it was co-written and directed by Matt Simba, who is also one of the men behind the original incarnation of the Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling, or as it's better known, Glow. Yep, that Netflix show was actually based on a real thing, but Mark Maron was based on Simba. The more you know. Dragging us back on topic, when it comes to inspiration for Indiana Jones, one name that often crops up is Alan Quartermaine, and that is how you pronounce it, not Quartermaine. There's no R in that part, so it's pronounced Quat, as in kumquat. Created by H. Rider Haggard for the 1885 novel King Solomon's Mines, Quartermaine was a big game hunter and adventurer who eventually appeared in 18 separate written works, most of which have aged poorly. Haggard was better about some things than his contemporaries. He refused to have Quartermaine use the N-word, for example, despite it being a commonly used term at the time, but there's still a lot of dissonant values strewn throughout his works. Not surprising for books that are well over 100 years old by now, but be aware of it if you want to track them down. Still, the character's influence was widely felt, and he would appear in numerous adaptations over the years. The earliest film, for example, is a silent one from 1919, and one of the most infamous was Sean Connery's portrayal of him in the awful League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. But for this video, I'm only counting the direct adaptations made after Raiders of the Lost Ark came out, since those projects are more likely to be re-inspired by indie, and therefore more along the lines of what I'm after. And because I really don't want to watch the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen again. I'm sure anyone else who suffered through that cinematic abomination will sympathise. As a result of this, I sadly have to skip over the 1979 film King Solomon's Treasure with Britt Ekland and Patrick Macnee, and instead have to jump to 1985's King Solomon's Mines, along with the sequel that it was shot back-to-back with, Alan Quartermaine and the Lost City of Gold, which came out the following year in 1986, both of which were made by our old friends at Cannon Group. Fortunately, King Solomon's Mines is a much better film than their last attempt at an indie-like, with John Rhys-Davies, yep, again, killing a man with an impractically placed trap within the first 2 minutes. And from that somewhat ridiculous start, we skip over the customary scene where we introduce the plot, instead speeding straight to a fast-paced adventure that pretty much never stops moving, while gradually explaining the premise over the course of the first half hour or so. To summarise, Sharon Stone, yes, that Sharon Stone, is trying to find her father, hiring Quartermaine to first help locate him, then beat John Rhys-Davies and the Germans to the titular mines. Because this adaptation takes place around World War I, as opposed to the late 19th century, the original story, and the Germans would use the riches within to nefarious ends if they got their hands on it. Much like with Hunters of the Golden Cobra, the fast pace works in the film's favour, and means the whole thing is pretty much non-stop, so you don't have time to worry about things like plot holes or whatever. It's helped by the fact that Richard Chamberlain, who plays Quartermaine, is really quite charming, so you're more than happy to hang out with him. Not quite so much Sharon Stone, whose line deliveries can come across a little awkward.
Besides, you should understand why I was so secretive. After all, what did I know about the great white African hunter? I mean, you could have stolen my map, slit my throat, and buried me under a maple tree.
Hell, I could still do all that.
Honestly, I'd blame it on the dialogue being a little clunky more than her acting. Ironically, her hiring was due to a misunderstanding. The producers had demanded they get that Stone woman, but they didn't mean Sharon Stone, they meant Kathleen Turner from Romancing the Stone. Naturally, she said no, so Sharon Stone. Her uneven performance, which again, not really her fault, isn't the only issue with the film. It's got some really obvious rear projection, what people use before green screens for you young whippersnappers. The action scenes, while impressive, can be awkwardly edited at times, usually when vehicles or explosions are involved. A few props aren't super convincing. There's a deeply uncomfortable scene where John Rhys Davies forces the head German to swallow diamonds that goes on way too long, and while the two leads are fun, I didn't really feel any romantic chemistry between them, so the inevitable romance falls a bit flat. Still, none of that detracts from the fact that this is surprisingly entertaining, and despite being kind of rough around the edges, it's still a fun romp that doesn't take itself too seriously and comes out all the better for it. Much as I'd like to say the same about the sequel, I sadly can't, as despite being filmed back to back with its predecessor, it's a much less entertaining film overall. This might be due to them filming on location for 6 months straight, and the leads being pretty drained by the end of it, or it might be because the script just isn't as good, or it could be the different director not being as competent. Hell, maybe it's a combination of all three and more. Whatever it is though, Lost City of Gold is much slower paced, much less adventurous, and much less fun. Plot-wise, it's about searching for the titular city, or more specifically, Quartermaine's brother, played by Chamberlain's real-life partner, which is weird, who went missing while he was hunting for the city. When clues turn up to suggest that he may still be alive, Quartermaine sets out to find him, while Stone throws a hissy fit because their long-planned wedding in America will have to be rescheduled as a result, which I think is supposed to be funny but just comes across as irritating because it's his bloody brother, woman! Sort your priorities out! Thankfully, they're joined on their journey by James Earl Jones, who's always a welcome face, and together the group set off on a much more muted adventure than the previous one. It's probably the slower pace and lack of impressive action scenes that make this film such a step back from the previous one. It's not an awful movie, far from it, but it suffers the same fate as Jewel of the Nile in that the first film was so much fun, a sequel was fast-tracked, and the rushed production makes for a lesser movie overall. I'd say Lost City of Gold is better than Jewel of the Nile, largely because Chamberlain and James Earl Jones are as charming as ever. Stone's actually okay once she joins the adventure, and because there's some unintended comedy in the fact that Shawarma, an Indian spiritual guru, reminds me of a character from The Master of Disguise.
Believe me, he hid these things in my garments to make me the fool.
I know who I am. I am Prince Lalejama from the Ringy-Dingy Heights near Bombay, Calcutta, and New Delhi, India.
I'd say I was sorry to inflict that on you, but I'm not. Now you will all share my suffering. Again, on its own terms, this isn't a terrible film, and if it had been the only adventure with these characters, I probably wouldn't sound half as negative as I have been. The biggest strike against it is that it is a sequel, and the film it's following up was really, really fun. Comparatively, this one's just kind of okay, I guess. It lacks a lot of the humour, the action, and the charm of the previous one, and if you watch them back to back, as I did, it comes off so much worse. I do still recommend it, but I'd actually recommend watching it before King Solomon's Mines, with that one serving as a prequel. You'll probably get more enjoyment out of things that way. Plans for a third film in the series fell through after Lost City of Gold bombed at the box office, and although there was going to be another stab at a sequel in 2011, with Chamberlain returning to the role, it too fell through when the intended director/producer died before filming began, sinking the whole project. As such, we'd have to wait a while before we got another film with the character. But wait a minute, I hear some of you say. Isn't High Adventure the third film in the series? Well, no. High Adventure does feature Thomas Ian Griffith as Chris Quartermaine, grandson of the original character, but the film makes it very clear it's a different version that he's descended from. Seriously, does this look anything like Richard Chamberlain? No. No, it does not. So, different continuity, although they clearly want you to think it's a continuation of those films, to the point the IMDb page claims that it is, which isn't saying much. IMDb can basically be edited to say whatever you like, but it does mean that at least some people were convinced of the connection. I think the main reason people assume it's a follow-up to the Chamberlain films is the time period High Adventure is set in. If you do the math of how old Quartermaine's grandson would be, any adventures with him would take place roughly 60 or 70 years after the events of King Solomon's Mines. That doesn't quite line up with the original 1880s set story. That would have High Adventure take place around the 1940s, and given the female co-lead of this film is German, and they don't mention the war, that seems unlikely. It does, however, kind of line up with the Chamberlain films, since they shifted their stories forward to the mid-1910s, and as such would place High Adventure in the late 70s or early 80s. Unfortunately, High Adventure is actually implied to be set in the 90s, with its laptops and scanners and credit cards and modern punks and all sorts of stuff. So that's just another thing counting against it being a sequel. What this really feels like is a TV movie, and the opening fight scenes aboard a train really don't do it any favours, with the awkward staging and the slightly over-the-top acting you'd expect from something like this. Things don't really pick up from there once the actual plot gets underway, with the two leads, accompanied by Quartermaine's assistant, trying to track down the lost treasure of Alexander the Great. This leads to yet more awkward action scenes that might have worked if the camera didn't cut every few frames, a montage that I think is supposed to be funny but just comes across as bizarre, a journey to Africa that could have been filmed anywhere, music right out of a kid's cartoon, and an ending that's probably the cheapest thing you'll see on this list. And that includes the opening to Treasure of the Four Crowns, so that's really saying something. Essentially, what I'm saying is that this is a very cheaply made movie, which isn't unexpected from Harry Alan Towers, the man behind it. Towards the end of his career, he was often working with very small budgets, and sadly, the filmmaking in general is pretty dodgy, with the camera frequently being way too close, the editing being pretty rough, and the pacing feeling like they cut every single interstitial shot they could to try and bring the runtime down, which results in a very jarring watch. And even when they do try to do something creative, it's usually in the form of things like the camera constantly circling around people. This actually made me a little nauseous, so apologies if you have motion sickness. Frankly, the big saving grace of this film is the lead. Thomas Ian Griffith is actually incredibly likeable, and without him the movie would be basically worthless. He's full of enthusiasm and charm, and he manages to carry the film through quite a few of its myriad issues. I wouldn't say he makes the thing watchable, since it's still kind of bad, but if nothing else it certainly made me want to watch his other stuff, so good for him, I guess. If you want to track this down, which frankly I don't really recommend, then have fun importing it. I've spotted French and German DVD releases but no native English ones, though thankfully the German DVD has an English audio track. It's not really worth the effort though, because this is basically a bad made-for-TV film with all that implies, and while Griffith is fun in the lead role, he, along with Quartermaine, deserved a much better film than this. Before we get to the next live-action adaptation, we have to go back to 1986 to briefly look at the animated version of King Solomon's Mines from Australia. Despite only being a little over 50 minutes long, it's somehow one of the more faithful adaptations of the story, which isn't saying much, but still, credit where it's due. And that's about all the credit it's going to get, because it becomes clear almost immediately that this is a quick and cheap version that's probably only as faithful as it is because changing it too much would have taken them more time to write it. I said I'd be brief, so here's some bullet points. The animation is basic and relatively limited, though the backgrounds are admittedly quite nice. The voice work is bland and often ill-fitting. This is Quartermaine, for example.
How do you do, sir? It's always a pleasure to meet an officer of Her Majesty's Royal Navy.
The dialogue is full of info dumps, literally explaining everything, which go on and on for way too long, especially in the second half. The music bounces between electronica nonsense, obnoxiously charged ditties, and the occasional piece that's surprisingly decent. The heroes are followed on their journey by a comedic lederhosen-wearing German solely so they have a villain to go up against, which is weird because he doesn't really add all that much, and the pacing is pretty lacking despite the relatively brief runtime, largely because not a whole lot that has any real impact actually happens, and even when it does, it's dragged out so much it loses all momentum. Ultimately, despite the problems, this is inoffensive but also non-essential, so I wouldn't bother. If you absolutely must though, don't spend money on it. It's on YouTube, so watch it there. So it was a while before the OG Quartermaine returned to live action, and when he did, it was in a two-part TV miniseries from 2004 when Patrick Swayze would take on the role. If you think that's a good sign, then it is, but probably not in the way you're thinking. I say that because Swayze is playing a more downbeat version of the character than Chamberlain did, which suits the more complex characterization the guy's been given in the miniseries. It's not a bad thing, but if you're expecting him to be super charming, then bear in mind he's playing down that aspect. Largely because his Quartermaine is depressed at not being able to take care of his son, which is why he's so happy to be hired by Alison Doody to help return him back to her father. If you're wondering where you know Alison Doody from, it's Last Crusade. The cynic in me wonders if that had any part in her being cast her, but she's actually quite good, so it doesn't really matter. Complicating matters is that Doody's father, I know her character has a name, but Doody's just fun to say, is not only being held captive by a native tribe who want the map, but there's also some Russians in it as well. They're essentially this miniseries equivalent of Nazis, and they explain it by having the search undertaken by Doody's father be financed by the Russian Tsar, which is a bit of a stretch, but it does lead to a fun couple of shootouts, so we'll let it slide. By virtue of essentially being two 90-minute movies, this is the longest adaptation of the story, and that's a very real strength. By giving the story time to breathe, the characters have a chance to open up, grow, and form connections, which none of the other versions really get the chance to do properly. It also means we get to take in some gorgeous scenery shots which really do look fantastic. It helps add a sense of scale to the journey the characters are taking. If there's a downside to this, it's that there's not a huge amount of action, and when there is, it's usually relatively muted. That's kind of par for the course with things set in this time period. I mean, you're not going to get any car chases or anything, but once you've seen one old-timey shootout scene, you've kind of seen them all. This is not the adaptation to watch if you want an action-heavy experience, because it's just not that kind of story. That said, that's kind of my only real criticism of this. On the whole, I think it's pretty good. The cast is fun to watch, the story's told fairly well, it's shot nicely, and it's just a decent way to experience the adventure. I'd actually recommend people do so if you've got 3 hours to spare. And as a bonus, it's on YouTube, so it'll cost you nothing but your time. Finally, the last major adventure starring the character is 2008's Alan Quartermaine and the Temple of Skulls, which is pretty much just another adaptation of King Solomon's Mines. That name might have made you think otherwise, but don't be deceived, it really is just King Solomon's Mines again, albeit on a much smaller budget and released around the same time as the 4th Indiana Jones film, because, if you haven't already worked it out, this is the first film we'll be covering that was made by the Asylum. For those who aren't aware, I should probably briefly explain who the Asylum are, and more importantly, how they operate. The Asylum is a California-based studio that primarily specialises in mockbusters, which is where they look and see what big films are coming out soon in theatres, then rush out a cheaply made film that looks similar enough to trick people into buying the DVD, thinking it's somehow connected. So that's how we end up with things like Transmorphers, or Top Gunner, or my favourite, Lord of the Elves, which was originally called Age of the Hobbits before the guys behind the actual Lord of the Rings movies got involved and said, yeah, no. And by favourite, I mean the name, not the film. Lord of the Elves is actually quite boring, even if it does have Kratos in it.
Boy.
Anyway, Alan Quartermaine and the Temple of Skulls is basically the Asylum seeing that Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull was coming out, having a quick look, seeing that the character of Alan Quartermaine was public domain, and then snapping together a cash grab of a film in the hopes of a quick buck, which they didn't get from me since it's also on YouTube, and a good thing too, since as you'd expect from an Asylum film, this wasn't very good. Though surprisingly, it's one of their better made mockbusters. The reason why is fairly straightforward. Most of their other efforts are very heavy on special effects, which results in things like Pacific Rim. But since Temple of Skulls is largely shot in villages or sets, it doesn't really have that issue. It still follows the basic outline of the original story. Person hires Quartermaine to find their brother, and they're accompanied by a black person who turns out to be the long-lost leader of an ancient tribe, but it does make a few interesting changes. The person hiring Quartermaine was the most obvious, especially since basically every adaptation makes them a woman, usually for Quartermaine to fall in love with, though not here, because, that would be effort. But there's also the fact that Quartermaine now has a son, which is why he's hired in the first place, to pay their school tuition fees. Does that sound familiar? And the black person is actually a woman this time round, which is a neat little twist. These changes aren't necessarily the most revolutionary, but they do make the story a little more interesting, so that's something of note. Speaking of notes, I also have to shout out the music, which is by far the most impressive thing about the film. The composer really goes for it with big orchestral pieces that work fantastically. Along with the location work, they did actually shoot this in South Africa, which is really quite surprising given it's the Asylum. This glosses more than the film deserves, because almost everything else falls short in one way or another. Not enough to completely sink the film, but even being one of the Asylum's better works doesn't make it all that great. Probably the biggest flaw is the acting, which is fairly one note. The British guy is overly polite, the woman is trying to be sultry, I think, the villain is incredibly slimy, etc. Not to mention that this version of Quartermaine is easily the most unlikable of all these films. He's overly harsh and rude for pretty much the entire first half of the film, and even when he's supposed to be warming up to the others, the actor doesn't really convey it very well. I can't tell if it was a deliberate choice or just the actor's lack of range, but either way it means the title character isn't super likeable, which isn't ideal. It's so bad that the only reason we think of this Quartermaine as the hero, quote unquote, is because the villain is so cartoonishly evil. He kills innocent people for no reason. He pops up at random whenever there's been too much dialogue and we need a change of pace. He straight up tries to kill the sultry woman at the end of the film for no real reason. He feels straight out of a Saturday morning cartoon, as does the titular temple since it's all CGI. Couple of other minor points. The fight scenes are edited so poorly you can barely make out what's happening. The dialogue can be hard to hear in the wide outdoor shots. The titular temple's kind of irrelevant, and the film just sort of stops right after that. Did the characters make it back home safely? Do Quartermaine and the sultry woman hook up? Does Quartermaine's son stay in school? Who knows? Who cares? Story's over. Here's that African tribe again, now go away. Is this a terrible film? Ultimately, no, not really. I've seen way worse Asylum films. There's way worse films on this list in general. It's just not an especially good film. And having gone through two much better adaptations of the story, this one feels even weaker by comparison, despite it having some things I did like. It was quite refreshing to not have Quartermaine and the sultry woman hook up, for example, even if it did leave their character arcs a little unresolved. Their relationship absolutely hadn't developed to the point it would have been believable, so I'm glad they didn't take it that route. I'm also not going to knock them for all the anachronistic things I spotted throughout the film, given they never actually say when it's supposed to be set. This is actually what kept my attention most throughout the film, trying to figure out when it takes place. I won't list all the conflicting evidence, that's what the IMDb page is for, but just know that there's a lot. Plus, it'll make for a great drinking game. Take a shot every time you spot something modern. Beer bottles? Shot. Cardboard boxes? Shot. Modern Coca-Cola logo? Shot. Towel with a name sharpied on the corner? Shot. Motion sensor alarm? You could double shot for that one. Plastic beads? You get the idea. Just don't count the clothes. Given the very small budget of the film, $50,000, the actors provided their own attire. Counting every instance of modern clothing would lead you to drinking yourself into a coma. And believe me, this film is not worth the hangover. So yeah, that's where we leave good old Alan Quartermaine for now, getting blackout drunk because the Asylum wouldn't spring for a few period-appropriate props. Thankfully, or not, we're supposed to get another random film using the character in 2023, brought to us by someone called Mark Hamill. That's Mark with a C. I somehow don't think it's its real name. Called Alan Quartermaine and the Spear of Destiny. Is that a reference to Indiana Jones or Wolfenstein 3D? You pick. I don't know too much about this one, except that it's filmed in England and the blurb mentions Nazi zombies, so I'm sure it'll be an all-time classic. Before we completely move on from Quartermaine though, I would also just like to quickly mention Deadfall Adventures, a first-person shooter from 2013 that has you playing as another grandson, James Lee Quartermaine this time, as he helps a US agent try to find the heart of Atlantis, which is also the subtitle given to the updated PS3 version they released the following year. The game didn't review super well, but I've played the PC version and it's fine. Nothing amazing and pretty rough around the edges, but I did appreciate the focus on puzzles, which helps it stand out from other shooters at the time. If you like games in the early 2010s, don't mind that it's clearly not got a AAA budget, and you can find it fairly cheap, I'd say it's worth a shot. If nothing else, it's definitely more entertaining, not to mention a far better send-off to this sort of franchise than Temple of Skulls. And if that's not worth its weight in gold, I don't know what is. Sticking with period pieces, Tex and the Lord of the Deep is a spaghetti western that, truth be told, isn't really an indie-like, but it does have some supernatural elements thrown into the mix that means there's a few similarities, even if it is somewhat of an outlier in the franchise. I say that because the character of Tex Willer is, or at least was, one of Italy's most popular comic characters, having been first created in 1948, and people have been trying to adapt the comic series into films since the 60s. None of those attempts succeeded until the mid-80s, when Duccio Tessari, considered one of the fathers of spaghetti westerns, got one off the ground as essentially a pilot to a potential TV series. Unfortunately, by focusing on adapting the stories with more fantastical elements, the end result is just weird, and it was a failure at the box office and with critics. Honestly, I think that's a little harsh. This isn't a fantastic film by any means, but it's not exactly terrible. Though starting with 90 seconds of exposition probably didn't put people in a great frame of mind. I suppose that's one of the risks of adapting a comic character, you have to catch people up to speed on their history, but having a Native American just sit there and tell you about it isn't a particularly good way of doing it, since that pretty blatantly violates the show don't tell rule. It does pick up a little from there, with the titular Tex tracking down a stolen shipment of guns that leads into a quest to find who keeps using volcanic minerals to instantly mummify people in an effect that's charmingly low budget, I think is the term. The overall plot is actually pretty simple. The Indians want to unite their various tribes and take back their land from the white man using these weaponized minerals, which is actually pretty understandable when you learn what people did to the Native Americans, so having them be the villains of this film is all kinds of awkward. Maybe that's my current year perspective talking, but either way it's kind of uncomfortable. Not helping matters is the cast. Everyone here is pretty bland, which I initially thought might be down to the English dub, but then I found the Italian version and it's not much better, so I guess it's just the film in general. These are all pretty stock characters, and while the acting isn't bad, there's not much for the actors, only one of whom is female for the record, to work with, so their performances aren't all that memorable. Normally the action might save things, but sadly it's fairly sporadic and nothing that you won't see done better in other westerns, so it's kind of a wash on that front as well. To say nothing of the ending, which is a complete letdown of nothingness. All in all, this isn't a bad film, but there's not really a whole lot here. The story, the acting, and the action are all kind of weak, so you end up with the movie equivalent of a watered down beer, which, yeah. Even the film's star was baffled by the choices made, saying there were plenty of other storylines that would have been better to adapt. I guess Tessari really wanted to have that supernatural edge to mimic Indiana Jones, but even then it's barely a factor in the film at all, so what was even the point? It's far from awful, but it's certainly no hidden nugget of gold. So far, you've probably noticed that we haven't looked at many major Hollywood productions. There's been a couple, sure. High Road to China, Jewel of the Nile, yada yada. But they've very much been the minority, and going forward, don't expect that to change too much. Certainly not in the 80s. Still, they do exist, and one of the biggest, most successful, and most well-known, even if you might not think of it as an indie-like, is the Goonies. Already I can see a bunch of you down in the comments furiously typing that The Goonies has got nothing to do with Indiana Jones. But here's the thing. What is the actual plot of The Goonies? It's a treasure hunt. A bunch of kids, the titular Goonies, find a map leading to a pirate's long-lost treasure, which they can use to save their homes that are being bought up and demolished to make way for a country club. And they go on an adventure to find it, while facing threats and unexpected traps along the way. When you put it in those terms, is it really that dissimilar from an indie-style quest? I'd argue not. Sure, it's more comedic and child-friendly. The main characters are kids after all, including Ki Kwan, so, you know, there's a connection. But it's still an adventure through a series of traps that wouldn't look out of place in the Temple of Doom or something. Look, there's no hard and fast rules with this list. If there were, I wouldn't have covered Motherlode. Besides, after some of the films I've covered for this list that were drier than the desert, being able to talk about a film that makes me smile from ear to ear is a really nice change of pace. Seriously, if you've never seen this film before, I really do urge you to check it out, because it is a ton of fun. But what else would you expect from a story by Steven Spielberg, a script from Chris Columbus, when he was still good, and a director like Richard Donner? I actually don't want to say too much about this one, because it is a pretty great film and I kind of want you to watch it without having everything spoiled ahead of time. But I will say that, again, the cast is mostly comprised of kids in their early teens, so if that's kind of a turn-off for you, it's probably a valid reason to not give this one a go. Additionally, while it can be very, very funny in places, some of the humour can be surprisingly dark. The villains are comedic, but also quite deadly, so there can be some interesting tonal shifts. If none of that is enough to drive you away, then I really cannot recommend this highly enough. The kids are surprisingly endearing, the humour is hysterical at times, the adventure is a lot of fun, and the film as a whole has something so many others on this list lack: heart. Most other indie likes are clearly soulless cash-ins, but this one is made by people who just wanted to tell a fun story, and it shows. Conversely, Treasure of the Amazon is exactly the sort of cash-in we've come to expect from indie likes, but that doesn't stop it from being entertaining, provided you watch the Riff Tracks version.
You know what I just realized? Rolling on a river is boring as hell.
Brought to us by Rene Cardona Jr., who also gave us Beaks, a shameless The Birds ripoff, Treasure of the Amazon is supposedly based in reality, as the opening title cards claim the stories from actual facts that occurred in 1958. It also claims to take place in a fictitious place though, which begs the question of why it's called Treasure of the Amazon, given that's a real place in Brazil. I know the film gives an explanation, but still. As it turns out, this is your fairly typical story of several groups of people venturing into the jungle to find hidden treasure, spiced up with the Nazi, jungle natives, and wild animals. So it's your boilerplate setup for this kind of movie, since filming in the jungle is fairly cheap, which is exactly what this movie is through and through. They did spring for some vehicles, a steamer boat and a seaplane, but the adventure as a whole is mostly just wandering through the forest, which we've seen plenty of by this point in this list. Thankfully, the cast is fairly solid, with Donald Pleasance and Stuart Whitman turning in entertaining performances. Pleasance in particular plays a former concentration camp guard, complete with accent and tribal wife who spends the movie basically topless. But the one you'll remember is Anne Sidney, who's clearly English but tries, and mostly fails, to sound like a Southern belle.
That trip they make without me. I'm going back to air conditioning, TV, and dressing up.
Hearing her slip in and out of the accent is equal parts entertaining and painful. I'd go into detail about the types of things everyone encounters along the way, but you've almost certainly guessed what they are. Rene Cardona Jr. isn't known for being original, and this film is the definition of a cliché storm, which is ironic because a storm is probably the only thing that doesn't happen in this film. Everything else does. Animal attacks, traps, native attacks, double crosses, you know what to expect. That said, I will give the film props for the ending, where the survivors don't all get away with their loot because they encounter customs officials. You don't get things like that in most of these, so that's one point the film's got going for it. It's just a shame it happens near the end of an almost 2-hour experience. Most versions are 10 minutes shorter because they cut out the gore, but it doesn't really improve the movie, so you're not missing out on much. Frankly, by this point you probably already know if this sort of film is going to appeal to you or not, and if it's not, then you can safely skip it and not miss out. It really is exactly the sort of thing you'd expect from a jungle-based treasure hunt style movie. Like I say, Riff Tracks, aka What If Mystery Science Theater Didn't Have the Silhouettes, covered this movie, and if you're going to watch it, I'd recommend watching that version. But if you're determined to find the original, then go for it. Just don't expect to be blown away by anything.
Please flip the cassette over to side B to continue the adventure.